Hello and welcome. You're watching World Talks and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. Polish President Andrzej Duda and senior officials took part in a series of commemorative events marking the yesterday's 15th anniversary of the Smolensk air disaster. Observed annually on April 10th, the anniversary honors the 96 victims of the crash, including Poland's then President Lech Kaczyński. Government and opposition officials, including the Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, joined the commemorations by paying their respects to the civilian and military victims. The Smolensk tragedy is a topic that still divides the Polish society and the world of politics. To discuss the social impact of this tragic chapter in the Polish history, I'm joined by Renata Mieńkowska-Norkiene, political scientist from the University of Warsaw. Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me here.
So, as we're looking at this very tragic chapter in the Polish history, how did the Smolensk catastrophe influence the political landscape in Poland in the short and long term?
Well, of course, we know that the consequences were enormous because it was the first such event in the Polish history. Of course, the Polish society had already been quite divided and polarized even before the Smolensk plane catastrophe. It's just that it probably speeded up certain processes of getting some of the positions, let's say, on the political scene a bit harder. Of course, we in Poland, we have this feature that right after certain crises, we know how to get together, and there is this impression of being united, but it lasts really short, usually a few weeks, and then unfortunately everything comes back to a sort of normal. And this was exactly the case in 2010. I think that this polarization had already been there, and it just got sort of deeper back then. Of course, we know also the political consequences because Bronisław Komorowski had to replace Lech Kaczyński, so the former president, or president who died in this plane crash.
A very unprecedented event as well.
Exactly.
To have some of the most important people in the country die in such an accident.
Absolutely, yes. And since then, of course, we may speak about, let's say, strengthening this government or governance of a civic coalition with the Polish Peasants' Party, because of course if we take a look at this political landscape before 2010, before Smolensk, we had a cohabitation where the president was from a different option than prime minister. We had some tensions, we had some tensions also on the level of participation in the European Union, because we had even quarrels as regards the representation of Poland in the European Council. So there were certain problems also before. After the plane crash, this situation changed a little bit, and Bronisław Komorowski became the president after the elections already. So this power was consolidated then in the hands of Civic Coalition and Polish Peasants' Party. And I would say this caused also certain speeding up of Europeanization processes, although Lech Kaczyński is the one who put his signature under Treaty of Lisbon. So we may speak about, on the one hand, deeper polarization of the Polish society. On the other hand, we can speak about certain consolidation of this liberal government that obviously we know eventually led to a winning of Law and Justice in 2015.
In what ways would you say that the political parties actually use the tragedy to maybe in a way advance their narratives or agendas on all sides?
Of course, that's a very good question, because when I mentioned this polarization, of course, I meant a societal polarization, but this partisan polarization on the level of political parties, it got strengthened too, and of course it got sharpened. And indeed, at first, there was this kind of unity where we could expect, let's say, some kind of mildering of the situation and of this polarization on the political party level. However, this didn't happen. So what happened actually was using the narratives, or actually, I would even make it stronger, this statement, or building narratives over Smolensk and this plane crash, in particular on the right side of the political scene, because we know that every month there were gatherings on the 10th, and the so-called miesięcznice, so monthly remembrance of the Smolensk disaster, of the Smolensk plane crash, that were used by Law and Justice mainly to consolidate certain environments that were extremely supportive for Law and Justice, in particular as regards this emotional and very conservative feature. So I think this was very useful for Law and Justice, in particular when they were governing, because this also maintained the steady impression of Law and Justice having, let's say, this moral, and in particular Jarosław Kaczyński having this moral, let's say, legitimacy to govern and to conduct all those extremely radically conservative reforms in Poland. Of course, the opposite side used Smolensk to underline how this dance macabre on the graves was conducted by the Law and Justice, which was hard to stand, of course, for more liberal, more progressive environments. And also, let's not forget that in Smolensk there were also representatives of not related to Law and Justice political parties and environments. So almost all political parties lost some representatives there, and we mustn't forget it. There were people who opposed the exhumations, unwanted, deeply unwanted. There were people who opposed what Law and Justice did actually with Smolensk, also in its narrative. But yes, it worked, of course, consolidating, and it helped Law and Justice maintain this emotional, let's say, tension all the time.
I would like to take a moment to take a look at the timeline. I mean, it's been 15 years since the crash took place. Where, particularly in time, there was a moment in the national unity that we observed right after the crash, when this accident turned into more of a deep political and social divide. Where in time did that shift?
Well, of course, we know that right after what happened, we experienced a few days, let's say, of at first a shock and kind of, I don't know, mixture of different feelings. On the one hand, a sort of lack of knowledge, lack of understanding of whether Russians might have had any kind of impact on what happened in Smolensk. Then there was this effort to unite. I still remember, because I was exactly at that point of time, I was in Liechtenstein, and I found out about it in Switzerland when there was a huge, let's say, discussion about that on the media.
I think
and
each one of us, when we look back at that day, the 10th of April, 2010, we can all remember where we were at that particular point.
Exactly,
I had this conversation with a number of people before the interview, and it's insane how people can remember specifically what happened.
Exactly, that particular moment, exactly. But that, for me, that meant, of course, witnessing discussions in Western Europe. So in this case, in Switzerland, in Liechtenstein, what happened. And there were discussions about to what extent it can negatively influence Polish-Russian relations, which were tented anyway, of course, because it was, let's not forget, 2 years after invasion of Georgia by Russia. And Lech Kaczyński wasn't a big fan of Vladimir Putin, as we know, and he warned against him. So this first moment, it was, let's say, this kind of hope that maybe those relations with Russia will get a little bit less sharp at that point. But it immediately vanished simply because our situation after Smolensk wasn't exactly as, for example, the Dutch plane crash, which we know, I mean, the shooting of the Dutch plane. What the Netherlands immediately did was internationalizing investigation. Here in the Polish case, I'm afraid we made lots of mistakes on both sides, but it's Russia, let's be honest, that stopped the process of making it all clear, transparent. And the Russians, most probably Putin, I'm more than sure, knew that the question of Smolensk and this whole plane crash, let's say, the emotions around it, can be used to polarize the Polish
As
society.
an element of division of the society.
Exactly, absolutely. This is Russia's modus operandi even now when we speak about how Russia impacts the political situation in Western Europe. Back then, it was an incredibly good and convenient opportunity for Russia to influence divisions in the Polish society. And I think that, of course, Antoni Macierewicz, with his committee, that was a total misunderstanding, but also contributed strongly to polarizing the Polish society, definitely not to actually discover what happened in Smolensk and why and what the cause of that really was. I think all this contributed also, and from that point of view, Macierewicz contributed to actually the Russia's expectations. I think this all has led also to the situation which we have now, that 15 years after what happened in Smolensk, that we still have people who do believe in a kind of assassination, who do believe in significance of that as regards, let's say, putting blame on Donald Tusk and so on and so forth. It was easy, by the way, to put the blame that Russians should be actually addressed on Donald Tusk, and this is what has actually been done by Law and Justice for all these 15 years.
Obviously, with this interview, we're trying to bring in awareness to our international viewers on what actually happened, because the situation is very complex. What would you say? What happens now? Do you think in years to come we're going to see some shift when it comes to the narrative? Are both sides, in terms of politics and civil society, are going to be less polarized as time goes by? Where do you see this going, and how is it going to play out?
That's the most interesting question about Smolensk I've ever heard, I suppose, because, of course, the question is not why we've gone through all that in such a, let's say, polarizing surroundings, because this was a sort of normal. I mean, Smolensk really did contribute to polarizing the Polish society, but the situation changes quite, I would say, dynamically. And what Putin at first did, which was, of course, polarizing and dividing the Polish society, I think he reversed it at least from some perspective, by invading Ukraine, because then the Polish society got immediately united, of course, against Russia. And I think that this kind of unity, even though we may speak about, let's say, less and less support for Ukraine, this all, I would say, got a little bit blurred, but still the Polish society is strongly anti-Russian. And from that point of view, Putin united us over, let's say, this thought that he's actually the threat. I think that what has recently happened is that Donald Trump contributed to that quite strongly. So as the Polish society, we are still, of course, polarized, but it's not Smolensk that polarizes us. I think it's more the fact that those two largest political parties, which is Civic Coalition and Law and Justice, they grew and they got strengthened as those two most important political powers in Poland over Smolensk as well. But now, I think what has been going on, and this polarization is rather initiated by algorithms. I heard, for example, that when Sławomir Mencen lost a little bit of support in algorithms on the internet, it was Adrian Zandberg whom algorithms pointed out as an interesting one for, in particular, younger generation of potential voters. So, of course, those two largest political parties, they search for their voters outside of the internet, which means they have to polarize the narrative, I would say, in mainstream media. And
obviously this dynamic is incredibly
Absolutely.
interesting because it's been 15 years, times have changed, and the medium of spreading information also changed.
Yeah, but Smolensk already got a sort of blurred, and it's not that powerful anymore. But of course, for those 15 years, we still bear consequences of Smolensk. But now I think that new challenges, they shift a little bit the Polish interest and the interest of the Polish people towards rather unity over the European Union membership, unity over protecting ourselves, our safety also from the Russians, and recently also of course, in this context of what America will do and what Donald Trump will do.
And with that, we'll have to put a full stop in there because our time on the program has come to an end. Thank you so much for an incredibly informative and interesting interview. Renata Mieńkowska-Norkiene, political scientist from the University of Warsaw. Pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you.
And so this would be all for now here on World Talks. We're back in just a moment with more news and features.